Here then are these two attitudes or syndrome of attitudes that go with a scriptural model of the self in God and the Western model of the self outside of God. According to Richard Househair, he has observed in many students that these attitudes and dispositions towards God are still active at times, or they're an unconscious attitude that arises spontaneously in a crisis or in other situations because it has never been fully looked at, evaluated, and updated by a good, a mature, evaluative judgment. Now is the time to do so, and especially if one is interested in the contemplative life and in the spiritual journey, one needs to clean up one's attitudes and not to bring to the journey, if you can possibly get rid of it, an attitude that is characteristic of a child, and especially a child who has picked up an emotional relationship to God or emotional overtones to the idea of God. Thus, the child may get the impression easily from parents in view of their sanctions that God is a policeman always watching you. Well, of course, God is always watching you, but not as a policeman. He's watching us to protect us, to sustain us, and to draw us onward on the spiritual journey. And it's coming as Savior, not as a policeman. Now, some policemen are very nice. They help you cross the street and they protect you from robbers. If you're going to think of God as a policeman, for God's sake, think of him as a nice policeman and who's not writing down all your misdemeanors in order to bring you to the judge. Okay. The other attitudes on that Western model can produce another caricature of God. And this one would be that he's always a tyrant demanding instant obedience to his will or else. And since in many myths and fairy tales that children have, they know what tyrants are and they're scared to death of tyrants. So if we communicate an attitude to the child that God is a tyrant, then obviously the child isn't going to want to go anywhere near him. And if you drag the child to church, you're creating, obviously, a conflict between the image of the church as a nice idea of God and the image that has been communicated to the child of a power that one needs to stay away from insofar as that can be done in a respectable manner in the local community. A third attitude towards God that is very easily communicated to the child who can't make a lot of distinctions is that God is a judge with his gavel raised, always about to come down with the final judgment of guilty. And so once again, God is presented with overtones of fear to which the primitive psychology of the child, who already fears the unknown, the darkness, the boogeyman, and the images of television of these space creatures which are hazardous, these are the things that are awakened and are easily attached to the idea of God, and then you get the idea of God with an emotional charge to it or resonances that are like a parasite idea, so that whenever one thinks of God, off goes the parasite idea, the corollary in the emotional judgment, which says, this God, whatever they say about him in church, is dangerous. I heard about him when I was an emotional and fragile child, and I know him as a tyrant, as a policeman, and as a judge, ready to condemn me to hell forever, even though I'm only a child. This is not only a caricature, it's a monster. And we need to erase it totally from our emotions. there is a genuine fear of God, but this is designed to get people started on the journey, or to enable people with hard heads and with dispositions that are cruel and malicious to realize that there will be an accounting for violence, oppression, extortion, and all kinds of premeditated evil, malice, and sin. But once someone has been converted to God, has begun the spiritual journey, then fear is useless, as Jesus himself said in one place in the Gospels. And one needs to trust him. And in actual fact, the fear of God is a technical term in the Old Testament, which means have a right relationship with God, and the right relationship with God is trust and service. So threats are only for the unconvertible, and only so long as it might take to get them to start on the road to true happiness and to the service of others, which is the supreme happiness in the gospel, at least according to the teaching and example of Jesus, who served us even to laying down his life on the cross. So if fear has a place, it's only at the beginning of the spiritual journey, and only to get us started. Once started, then the fear is useless, and we need to develop trust and responsibility. And this grows in the service of God and in our efforts to be united with him and to serve others in love. In other words, to love our neighbor as ourselves. This can't be done if one is constantly afraid of God. So we should not translate that technical term in the Psalms and in Scripture of the fear of God as the emotion of fear, because that emotion tends to frighten us to the point of staying away from God as much as possible. And this will hardly facilitate the spiritual journey, which requires a maximum of trust and indeed unbounded confidence as it unfolds. With this in mind, let me turn your attention to the value of contemplative prayer and practice as an indispensable means for developing the contemplative dimension of the gospel and those dispositions that we just recorded as the self in God and God in us, which is the essential starting point in regard to a mature attitude and a spontaneous and energetic attitude as we commence the spiritual journey. Centering prayer is really a term to describe the traditional meaning of contemplation. The word contemplation has received many meanings in recent times, and so the centering prayer is intended to be an effort to identify one meaning of that traditional and classical term. And that meaning is its original meaning as resting in God, as that gradual evolution of acquaintanceship and friendship with God that moves to the maturity of communion, which is a deeper level of relating to God than conversation or thinking about him. It is being with God and resting in him beyond concepts, however good, and beyond particular acts, except to wait upon God in loving attention during the parameters in which one devotes oneself to this interview or encounter. Now, the practice of this tradition, which we call centering prayer, consists, oddly enough, in taking a vacation from ourselves. If you go to Miami or Alaska or wherever you like to go for your vacation, you take yourself with you. And the self that we know best is the false self system that has developed from early childhood into the age of reason, and which has been somewhat damaged or distorted by the vicissitudes of early childhood, and especially experiences of a traumatic emotional type, which we at an early age were not able to handle or to integrate into, with the resources we had, into the rest of our daily life. And so we repress them, or the damage or a residue of that damage remains in our nervous system as stress or tension or blocks to the free flow of the natural and divine energies that are unconscious and our psyche possess. So this false self system consists of the instinctual need for security that the infant has, and the instinctual need for pleasure and for independence in some degree, for controlling the environment that the child experiences more or less a little later in its development, more or less 2 to 4. Instead of these instincts developing normally and being integrated into the next levels of human developing consciousness, they frequently become fixations, and the body and mind continue to grow according to the pattern of the blueprint in the brain, but the emotional area of the previous level of consciousness remains intact or fixated in a certain attitude of demand involving compensation for real or imaginary privations of the instinctual need in question, whether it was security, power, control, affection, esteem, or pleasure. From 4 to 7, one absorbs the emotional and moral attitudes of the parents, unquestioningly, as well as the cultural attitudes of one's peers and of the culture in which one lives. And this makes the instinctual needs and the programs for happiness based on their privation all the more complex as we develop social relationships and add a moral kind of judgment to our actions and activities, which are heavily weighted on the side of the moral attitudes of parents and important authority figures in our early environment. So our self-image, our self-worth begins to be identified with this false self that arises from this complicated emotional development from instincts that have been deprived or damaged into programs for compensation, into energy centers which are motives around which our actions and thoughts revolve, that have as their center the selfish drive or demand or should for compensatory experiences that are translated roughly as seeking more and better pleasure out of life, more and better security symbols, and more power and control over situations, other people. And this syndrome of attitudes is thoroughly established as a value system in the unconscious and is encouraged in our conscious life by most cultures. Thus, look at any advertising. It usually appeals to one of those three energy centers: power, pleasure, security, or the attitudes of the local culture. So, with this in mind then, if we could take a vacation from the thought system of our ordinary waking psychological experience and not think any thoughts or give our attention to the thoughts that are passing along the surface of our consciousness, we would then have an enormous rest, an enormous vacation, because our ordinary flow of thoughts is shot through with emotional reactions that reflect, stimulate, fortify, and increase, if anything, the intensity of our energy centers for these happiness projects which can't possibly work in adult life. And the amount of energy we put into every day in order to keep a certain equilibrium as life significantly interferes with our plans for this happiness that is based on instinctual needs, then we would have an enormous amount of energy rest for other things a lot more useful. Hence, the contemplative prayer addresses itself to this situation. And during the parameters of an encounter with God, one puts oneself through faith in the presence of God and accepts the usual flow of thoughts along the surface of the stream of consciousness, but disregards their content and refuses to follow out the attraction that certain thoughts or emotions exercise on our false self-system and our conscious or unconscious motivation. Thus, by letting go of the particular perceptions that are going across the superficial level of our consciousness, our ordinary psychological life, we separate these thoughts as if you were separating boats, you might say, that were closely packed together and coming down sort of stem to stern on a river. So closely tied together that you can't see the stream or river on which they are resting. So the practice of centering prayer is to separate the boats a little, with a view of allowing the river on which they're floating to begin to come into awareness. Now, the river represents our spiritual nature, on which all our faculties and their contents are resting. They're not hanging in midair. They have to rest on something. What they're resting and adhering in and are rooted in is our spiritual nature with its particular spiritual resources, faculties, and gifts. And that level of our being is almost never perceived in ordinary life unless you take some discipline, such as the centering prayer, and meditate. Or once in a while, God may take the initiative, since, as we saw in the scriptural model, he dwells in our inmost being, and we emerge at every level of our being out of that source. He can reach up any time and pull you down, or open the trap door, you might say, and let us have a radiance of his sweetness, beauty, or perfume, whatever you might want to imagine it. And this makes us aware of this new depth within us that we had never touched before. Unfortunately, this has not always associated with God or as a religious experience. Some people attribute it to their digestion or nature or art or something, when in actual fact, it's completely beyond the reach of any creature to produce. So, but normally we don't have an experience of that level of our being or the God who dwells at its source and root unless we undertake a spiritual discipline such as contemplative prayer or the centering prayer, which is aimed at reducing the obstacles to the development of that grace, the grace of contemplation. We tend to identify ourselves with the ordinary flow of perceptions that are passing through our imagination and memory when we try to sit down and pray and quiet our minds in some degree from their usual preoccupations. And so a vacation from our ordinary thoughts brings with it a great deal of rest and also a certain distancing from our ordinary selves and our experience of our ordinary selves. In other words, we disidentify with the ordinary flow of thoughts with this self-image that it manifests, and begin to become aware of the possibility of a new way of looking at ourselves that is under the new influence of the emerging values and experience of our spiritual nature as it insinuates itself into consciousness in between the boat, so to speak, or the perceptions as they flow down the stream of consciousness, but now as a result of this practice are somewhat spread out, slowed down, and perhaps reduced to some single thought that we introduce into our imagination as the symbol of our intention to open to God and to our spiritual nature at its deepest level. It is this disidentification with our ordinary psychological self or consciousness that enables us to experience emotionally the possibility of change, which gives us a certain openness to let go of our preconceived ideas inherited from early childhood about the spiritual journey and our prepackaged values largely in the unconscious, which gradually become conscious in the process of a practice of contemplative prayer, such as we will be outlining in the next 5 conferences, beginning with a conceptual background for the psychological development of centering prayer, and then a fairly complete presentation of the method and practice and its progress and development. And then we will move to a study of the human condition to understand the full value of contemplative prayer and its importance, its fruits, and the marvelous changes that it can effect in our conduct, in our attitudes, in our understanding of life, in our ministry to others. We need to understand the human condition to which contemplative prayer addresses itself as a divine gift to heal the distortions, the wounds, the trauma, and the biases, the prejudices that we bring with us from early childhood because of the fragility of that early period of our life. And so, in order to gain a comprehensive view of our human nature and our human condition, we will look at several different models of the human condition so that we can see the same reality from different perspectives. An evolutionary model, a static philosophical model, the existential model, the developmental model from developmental psychology, and finally bringing these various views, understandings of human nature from different perspectives, we hope to culminate in a discussion of the specifically Christian model of growth and transformation. And this will bring our course to its full completion, which is a beginning, an attempt to try to re-express the immense values and riches of the Christian contemplative tradition into dialogue with contemporary science, especially anthropology, developmental psychology, and also with an open ear to the wisdom of the other great spiritual traditions of the world religions, and thus to begin a renewal of the specifically Christian tradition and theology of ascetical and mystical wisdom. We invite you to join us in this project and hopefully to build on this modest beginning, a first attempt to re-express that tradition in terms of the invitation of Vatican II to renew theology in the light of its sources in the gospel and in the fathers of the church, East and West, and in the monastic desert fathers, and in the succeeding centuries of unfolding understanding, insight, and wisdom into the spiritual journey in its Christian presentation.